When the rains fail for extended periods, agriculture suffers, and populations depending on locally grown crops suffer as well. In places like Ethiopia, where around 85% of people work on the land, the consequences of drought are extreme. People are forced to leave their homes, becoming environmental refugees. They move to towns in search of relief that may not come. Though droughts are part of a natural weather cycle, their frequency in places like the Horn of Africa is increasing, and drought has been following drought. Climate change is being blamed, but population pressures and political troubles are compounding the picture. Countries like Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, and the Sudan are again on the brink of famine, with as many as 16 million people at risk of starvation. Northern Ethiopia, 1984. Malnourished children and their parents are waiting for food aid at the relief station of Karem. The crisis was precipitated by consecutive droughts, widespread soil erosion, and disastrous land policies, with more than 1 million people starving to death as a result. Critics blamed the former Marxist government of Mengistu Haile Mariam for ignoring the famine until it spiraled out of control. Around the world, people were stung by television coverage of the crisis as people lay wasting. An international relief operation was mounted. In Britain, Irish singer Bob Geldof organised friends from the music industry to record a song to raise funds to help relieve the Ethiopian tragedy. Called Do They Know It's Christmas, the song was released in record time and became a phenomenon, selling more than 3 million copies in the UK. Everyone gave their time freely, and Geldof even convinced the British government to waive taxes on the record's sales. Today, amid poverty and recurrent drought, Ethiopia still struggles to feed a growing population of 70 million, most of whom are peasants. The country remains a focus for international food aid, but the government is trying to introduce agricultural reforms to help the country cope better when the rains do fail. But the cycle of drought has kept repeating, and global warming is being blamed for making a difficult situation worse. Farmers lease land from the government but cannot buy their small plots. Critics say lack of ownership fosters insecurity and discourages farmers from making even small improvements to the land. In Tigray province, one of the regions most affected by the 1984 famine, farmers now have greater access to drought-resistant and higher-yielding seeds, but farming techniques remain small-scale and labour-intensive. Despite these small improvements, aid agencies like Oxfam and the World Food Programme say up to 5 million Ethiopians are chronically unable to feed themselves. Many in the donor community say the government could do more to reform a land policy seen as a root cause of its food woes. In the past, the government has grappled with its food problem by forcibly resettling Ethiopians from the drought-prone highlands to the more fertile lowlands. Droughts have been followed by flood, followed again by drought, so water conservation projects are being encouraged. Dams reinforced with thick plastic sheeting to collect rainfall, and small-scale irrigation channels are being introduced. Where sorghum, maize and barley once grew, some fields are now green with cabbages, potatoes, garlic and tomatoes, as farmers try their hand at cultivating vegetables. In neighbouring Sudan's Darfur region, political instability and poor growing conditions have displaced thousands, causing yet more stress in Ethiopia. For the moment, the situation in Ethiopia is not severe, but dangerous preconditions exist that have the government and international aid groups worried. In some regions, the markets are still able to meet demand and the local economies are functioning. But the country and the whole Horn of Africa is balanced on a knife edge. In the north, crops are failing, and internally displaced refugees are filtering into rural centres in search of assistance. If the dry spell continues, the young and the weak will start to die. During 2002, drought hit severely in southern Africa. In Malawi, a landlocked country rated by international agencies as one of the world's 10 poorest states, families were reduced to boiling edible flowers, bulbs, and discarded maize husks. All forms of plant usually not eaten became food sources, even though the nutritional value was marginal at best. Hunger drove others to uproot the banana trees that would have provided food later in the year, to boil the roots into a sour but edible mush to maintain life for a few more days. The Malawi government declared a national disaster. Apart from the people that starve when drought strikes, the effect on survivors can resonate for generations. When children are malnourished, it can affect their development, preventing them from reaching their full potential. Developing countries have a high birth rate because infant mortality is severe, and parents rely on their children to provide for them in later life. Empty granaries and filling malnutrition wards indicated a looming disaster in Malawi. The Chankungu Health Centre became a temporary sanctuary for mothers and their malnourished babies, with aid workers implementing feeding programs of porridge and supplements fed as often as every 2 hours. The Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Zomba also became a rescue station for malnourished babies, with mothers and nurses using syringes and nasal feeding tubes to supply high-protein food to children and babies too weak even to cry. Even though these babies were saved, they could carry a range of impairments for life, including stunted growth, reduced intelligence or reduced muscle growth, and poorer health overall. According to the World Health Organization, hunger and malnutrition is the most serious threat to the world's public health, and malnutrition is by far the biggest contributor to child mortality. At Lilongwe, the government silos stood empty, not because their contents had been depleted during the crisis, but because a 167,000-ton strategic reserve of maize had been sold in expectation of a bumper harvest. Across the country, the next 2 crops failed. The people of Malawi were told the maize had been sold to Kenya because it was turning bad. Fields of withered brown stalks stood as a stark reminder of this part of the world's vulnerability to drought. The harsh desert region in western Eritrea, known as Gashbarka. In 2002, after 30 years of exile in neighbouring Sudan, these Eritreans were returning home. But the shock of relocation was clearly evident. To re-establish lives in this region, the first priority had to be water. With the help of donkeys, women and children travelled long distances to carry water. This meant children were spending more time looking for water than going to school. The established residents raised concerns that the influx of returnees risked overextending the existing water supply. To make sure that the arrival of the returnees didn't breed unnecessary tension, engineers were contracted by the United Nations Refugee Agency to dig new boreholes and equip them with water pumps. With the new pumps, both the established residents and the returnees were guaranteed access to clean water. A program was established to train local people in care and maintenance of the bores and pumps, and a parallel scheme was set up to educate people about the most hygienic way to transport and to store water. As water became less difficult to fetch, the children were able to go back to school. As the nation was emerging from its 30-year war with Ethiopia, officials were trying to organise scarce national resources to build a basic infrastructure that had been neglected for too long. The United Nations was giving some support, but aid money is as scarce as water in this part of the world. Across the region, there are reminders of the country's protracted war with neighbouring Ethiopia. Water has always been a problem in this part of Africa. Except for the capital, Asmara, the main drinking water supply source across Eritrea is groundwater, which must be replenished by rains. Some aid agencies were concerned that the new influx of people to the Gash-Barka area would only be able to survive in times of plenty. In times of drought, even the deepest wells and bores can dry up, and the more water that is taken from the groundwater supply, the quicker this will happen. The following year, 2003, both Eritrea and Ethiopia were in drought. Crops had failed and livestock were dying. These women were preparing a meal. This portion of maize was all that they had left, and tomorrow they would go hungry. In Ethiopia's Western Harigi district, memories of the 1984 famine were still fresh. This family had nothing left to eat and were going to walk to a town in search of aid. They carried with them everything they owned. Fatuma Ami was just one of more than 14 million in Ethiopia who were affected by this drought. At the time, over 260,000 of Eritrea's people were living in refugee camps like this, in and around the town of Barentu. They fled here during the 1998 border war and were already relying on food aid. United Nations and aid agencies such as the Red Cross started trucking food and other relief supplies to the most remote regions. It meant that families already weak from hunger wouldn't have to walk long distances for food. Grains available at the aid centres included maize, barley and sorghum, but not the Ethiopian and Eritrean preference, teff. This small, millet-like grain was one of the first crops to disappear when the rains failed. This distribution centre was forced to take extreme measures by reducing its food rations. Each family received less to allow more people to be fed. In Ethiopia, farmers received emergency agricultural assistance to help them prepare land for the next planting season, and it started relocating willing farmers to areas less affected by the drought. Again, the drought problem was complicated by political tensions. The Ethiopian government had rejected a UN resolution regarding the border town of Badme, and hostility with Eritrea started rising again. Food distribution programs were being disrupted and the famine would become more severe. The international aid agencies were also trying to cope with the border crisis, and water supplies became even more tenuous. When every effort needed to be made to alleviate the food crisis, two of the world's poorest nations were bringing troops to the border region to prepare for any escalation in the simmering border dispute. Meanwhile, the suffering of innocent victims of drought continued to worsen as aid agencies struggled to keep the internally displaced refugees alive. Also in 2002, India's northwestern state of Rajasthan was hit by drought. 5 monsoon seasons in a row had failed to deliver water to the underground aquifers, and livestock were suffering. The water table in the Bama district had gone down several metres due to the failure of the rains. 80% of people in the state depend on around 50 million livestock for their livelihood, and authorities initiated programs to help them counter the drought's effects. Silt was removed from dried irrigation channels, and the State Animal Welfare Board opened centres to provide free fodder and water. When the water table in the area dropped, all the wells and ponds went dry, so the authorities installed temporary ponds of 12,000 litres capacity at various places. Though people suffered financially, the government made certain that aid was quickly made available. But sometimes, when the conditions are good, the wrong things grow. By 2004, Northwest Africa had had 2 years of good rain, providing ideal conditions for plague locusts. When they swarm, there can be between 40 and 80 million locusts in 1 square kilometre. The Sahel region began preparing for severe crop damage. When these locusts are able to fly, they will be able to travel 130 kilometres or more each day. Desert locusts live for between 3 and 5 months. Females will lay eggs at least 3 times during their lives, and each time will produce up to 80 eggs. The eggs take 2 weeks to hatch, and these immature locusts will turn into fully grown adults in just over a month. This group is already on the move and will soon be learning how to fly. The difference between locusts and regular grasshoppers is that locusts are able to change their behaviour and habits. Normally they are solitary animals, but when their numbers increase, they congregate and migrate to find food. This swarm in Mali cut a path of destruction as it moved west from the northern town of Timbuktu. Spraying pesticides on crops and vegetation is currently the only way to stop the insects. But when locusts can affect thousands of square kilometres, this is no small task, and the countries affected need help. A few days ago, this farmer's field had been filled with millet, almost ready to harvest. The locust swarm took only minutes to devastate the crop. This is all that remains. This scene was repeated across the Sahel, and food shortages loomed. It was not just the farmers that were affected. Nomadic pastoralists grazed their livestock in this area after the rains. But this year, their traditional migratory routes had to change because locusts had eaten all the grass. The countries in the Sahel don't have the money to control an invasion like this on their own. In the Senegalese capital, Dakar, people tried to get on with their lives as the swarms closed in around the city. For some, it was even a form of entertainment, but for most, protecting their food was the priority. Most efforts seemed futile, with people waiting for the locusts to move on so they could start again. Drought and famine are the scourge of Africa, and with growing populations and changing climate, it is feared that these problems will gain momentum. Food insecurity is commonplace across the continent, with any deviation from average conditions pushing whole regions into malnutrition and starvation. Investment in water infrastructure, healthcare, and more scientific agricultural techniques are needed. But too often, poor countries are caught in a vicious circle of underinvestment, underproduction, and overpopulation. International aid organisations ship food to famine areas, but huge amounts of money is spent to render short-term help. Now, scientists are offering a new solution to the cycle of drought and famine across the continent. biotechnology is being used in an attempt to develop drought-resistant crop varieties. Uganda was reeling from a devastating cassava mosaic disease. Harvests dropped dramatically, and the disease spread to other parts of Eastern Africa. They have since started growing the new varieties developed by the National Cassava Program with the assistance of the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture. They are also trying to develop pest-resistant crop varieties. But genetic modification is still a controversial issue, with many believing the long-term effects of altering the genetic blueprint of plants are still unknown. Already, this issue has sparked fierce scientific and ethical debates in Europe, where many governments have strict policy guidelines that regulate the biotechnology industry. With no clear guidelines on genetically modified crops from African governments, companies involved in genetically modified foods have found an ideal testing ground on the continent. But it's hard to argue against the benefits. In Kenya's Central Province, small-scale farmers are already seeing benefits from biotechnology. When the Panama and Sigatoka diseases wiped out entire banana plantations, it caused a localized famine. When new disease-resistant banana varieties became available, growers were quick to adopt them. Finally, despite loud calls for free trade, Western governments continue to protect their agricultural sectors.